Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Elizabeth Forsythe Hailey, author of A Woman of Independent Means and many other wonderful books. Thanks for being here, Betsy.
I love coming to Tulsa, Teresa.
We love having you here. You've had such an interesting writing career. I've known you for years and I just realized that you used to write for soaps. Love of Life.
That was my apprenticeship, really, because I almost flunked creative writing in college. It's a very intimidating atmosphere. You're reading great literature, and the idea of trying to write is very intimidating. But when my husband was hired to write soap opera, because he was a known playwright, he said, my wife is also a writer. And they like husband and wife writing teams on soap operas because it's very hard work and very intensive. And I said, I am. We'd met on a newspaper. I'd never written plays.
Yeah.
But it was great fun because you would be handed an outline and all you had to do was dialogue it. So it was easy steps and nobody could pretend it was literature.
So that lowered the bar a little bit
Exactly.
and just freed you
But
up.
it was like playing a game, like with chess pieces, because you know the characters are established, you are very limited in the number of sets. And we inherited a job from Richard and Esther Shapiro, who left daytime soaps, and they said, we have this great idea. We think the soap opera form would be very successful at night. People love continuing stories. So they went on to create Dynasty.
Yeah. I love Dynasty.
I mean, they made a fortune. We were off to Europe, so they invited us to come along on that ride, but we didn't. But it's a wonderful form for just learning the craft.
Well, yeah, and for doing the dialogue. I mean, there's nothing better than learning to generate dialogue. Do you remember any of the plot lines from back then?
A lot of amnesia.
That's a favorite, isn't it? And it's hard to write dialogue for amnesia.
And I actually used that experience in my third novel, Joanna's Husband and David's Wife, which is closest to my own life and marriage, when she starts becoming a writer by working with her husband on soap opera, and so I made fun of the form a bit.
How hard is it to share that closer writing partnership with a spouse? I mean, it's wonderful in many ways, but there are bound to be some tricky periods too.
Well, for me, it really was an apprenticeship. We didn't start out as equals. He was an established playwright, and so I was in a much more of a student position in a way. So it was a very safe way to learn the craft. I had nothing to prove, really. And so for me, also, we have very different strengths. I love prose. I love reading novels. His forte was dialogue because he's a playwright. So as we went along and working together in television, you have to present prose outlines often to pitch a story. You're paid and then you have to write it. And that was the part that was easy for me. I loved spinning the tale. And then when it came to the actual script, he would do the first draft. So we sort of took turns. We weren't actually collaborating line at a time.
You worked on a lot of series together, Macmillan and Wife. How much fun was that?
That again was incognito. Oliver was the only credited writer on that, but he would give me a scene to write sometimes, particularly a domestic scene, because that was inspired by the Thin Man series. So there was a lot of witty banter between husband and wife, and he would give me those to do a first draft, and if he liked it, he'd use it, and if he didn't like it, he'd write it.
I was watching some DVDs of the first few seasons of Family. I was doing this about a year ago. And on one of those episodes, you do have a writing credit.
That was my first.
Was that your first?
I think they changed it totally. I have no memory of it whatsoever. I have no memory of what we wrote or no memory of what they eventually filmed. But I liked that series very much. That was a Broadway playwright who did the pilot for that. The writing was always very high level.
Oh, it was wonderful.
And so was the acting.
Oh, it was Sada Thompson
Sada
started.
Thompson.
It was interesting, though, the era, because she always wore dresses around the house when she was cleaning and everything, and it was. Then you wound up eventually on a great training ground, Mary Hartman. Mary Hartman. How did you wind up
Well,
there?
and that, again, Norman Lear, I always say, in a way, brought me out of the closet because he seemed to know that I wanted to write. That was before Family, I think. Oliver was brought in because, again, it was a nighttime soap opera, but also a spoof. So the fact that we'd had experience in daytime soap opera was very important. We actually were not the credited writers. Oliver was hired as a creative consultant.
That's what I recall.
But that meant he was on the floor working with the actors because it was a wildly talented but wildly crazy bunch, especially Louise Lasser.
Oh, of course, yes.
And she would improvise with no thought to the fact that this was a continuing drama. And you had to track it. You couldn't mention something and then contradict it later. So Oliver was like the ringmaster, really cracking the whip and coming up with lines and keeping everybody on schedule. And then when I was brought in later, he worked alone the first 6 months. I was brought in again to help with the story projections, the outlines, which were great fun because Norman Lear was such an independent thinker. He had not been able to sell the series to a network. He was selling it independently, which meant we had no network censors. And it was a free-for-all. I mean, something would happen in the news, and Norman would meet with us and say, let's do something like this. And one day he said, you know, let's have the coach drowned in a bowl of chicken soup. So we did. The next week it was written and on the air. So it was just a free-for-all. But
so edgy, so edgy.
I think there's been nothing like it since, really.
I bought the DVDs. We're showing some clips of it even as I speak.
Oh, really?
I mean, I loved it. And they wouldn't show it nighttime in Oklahoma. They would show it in the daytime. They didn't want kids to see it.
Interesting.
Because you really crossed some boundaries
Absolutely.
in that show.
And we took on anything. I mean, from sex therapists to you know, the kind of therapy, we called it STET, which is, you know, the copywriting symbol for leave it the way it was.
Yes, yes. Why do you think that show was so popular? Because it had a huge cult following.
There was one writer in particular of the original three. The head writer, Ann Marcus, was a wonderful woman, but she really came out of soap opera, and she kept everybody plotting. But there was a brilliant writer named Daniel Gregory Brown who came up with the idea of bone cancer in the inner city and the waxy yellow buildup. He was kind of a eccentric genius, and I don't know how he got connected with it. He gave it the edge. And sadly, we did another pilot with him after Mary Hartman, but his agents could never really get him another job, and he ended up committing suicide. Very tragic, because he was really had a wonderfully skewed and brilliant mind.
Your husband, as you noted, Oliver Hailey, was a wonderful playwright. What do you look to as his most significant plays, the ones that have touched you the most?
Well, I think Oliver always knew that the family was the heart of drama, and I think he taught me to appreciate the drama within my own family, which I'd always taken for granted. His quite autobiographical play, Who's Happy Now, really launched our life in California. That play ended the premiere season of the Mark Taper Forum and was bought by Burt Lancaster, actually, who happened to be in the audience for Universal for film. It was never made, though later the play was done on PBS as part of the Theater in America series. But I think Who's Happy Now was probably the most crucial because it took raw, painful elements from his own life and turned it into something very theatrical with a lot of humor. It just did what art is supposed to do, just take these painful, raw moments from your own life and truly transform them so they touch other people in a way that's kind of universal.
When he was working on plays, did he ever share the scripts with you?
Oh, very much. We always, and I actually had a hand in his other very successful play, Father's Day, which has had a long life and many permutations. But we had met. In fact, she did Oliver's first professional production, Estelle Parsons, who Tulsa audiences know very well from August Osage County. But she had not done any drama at this point. Oliver was right out of Yale Drama School, 1962, and had a summer stock production of a play called Hey You Light Man. Estelle starred in it. We met her, and she just sort of had such a great influence on both of us because she had such strong, passionate, outspoken ideas about what theater should do. And she was also a very volatile, dramatic person, and none of us had really known firsthand people in the theater world. So I actually started writing a short story because I was so fascinated by her relationship with her young twin daughters. She would be so loving one minute and a crazy lady the next, all of which she uses to great effect.
Wonderfully,
yes, on the stage. Yes. And Oliver read the first page of it, and he said, oh, "This is great." He said, "Do you mind if I take this and write a play?" So her character became the focal character in a play about 3 divorced women, and then in the second act, their husbands have come. It's Father's Day, and they've come to take the children. That play has had a long and interesting life.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, you wrote your novel. We mentioned at the top of the show, A Woman of Independent Means. How did that come about for you? I mean, you've had this sort of apprenticeship with Oliver, you've done the TV writing, and then you're doing a novel.
Well, I think it was that stage in my life when I've happily married, have 2 children, and yet I don't have anything really solid to show for my life since college that I've done as an individual. And Oliver would always take breaks from television and go off and write a new play. And I'd been sort of existing with a secondhand career, you know, helping him on whatever he was doing. And I would feel quite abandoned and bereft because I didn't have a project of my own. So I thought, well, I think I'm going to try to write a novel. And I had the idea of doing it in letter form because I thought that would be manageable. But the first idea I had, and based on what was happening in my own life and all around me, was Letters from a Runaway Wife. It was that time. And Oliver, when I told him the idea, he said, runaway wives are just a passing fad. By the time you get a novel written, and that'll be over and done with. And he said, why don't you write about a woman who doesn't have to leave home to be liberated? A woman like her grandmother.
What a great insight.
My grandmother made a great impression on Oliver. I, of course, had taken her for granted. She was my grandmother. And he always saw her as quite a unique and formidable character. And she'd had a great many tragedies in her life. She was very outspoken and ahead of her time in many ways. So after pouting for 24 hours, I thought about it, and I thought if I could just keep the letter form. I'm not sure I can write a novel, but I've always liked writing letters. And it would be a shorthand way to span a whole lifetime. I love 19th century novels. I like to go from childhood to old age. I want to know the whole arc of a life. And this gave me a way to do it. And also, when I met Neil Simon later, he said, you've written a novel that playwrights can read because it was a form of shorthand.
What an interesting insight.
Skipped all the descriptions of scenery and physical appearance, which don't interest me very much. I'd rather know what a person's thinking and feeling.
As you wrote these letters, did you ever feel that you were getting to know your grandmother better? I mean, in a new way?
Absolutely. You know, by that time I was married with children, so I was seeing her as a woman, a married woman with children, not as my much older grandmother, and I was living her life with her, and also because I'd led a fairly sheltered life. I'd been very fortunate not to have lost a parent at an early age, as both of my parents had, to have a healthy husband and happy children. I didn't know how I just didn't know how you survive the kind of tragedies she lived through, losing first her husband, then her son, 10-year-old son. Her house burned down. My mother was hit by a car at the age of 3 and spent a year in the hospital. And so by putting myself through her life in my imagination, I was trying to understand the sources of her strength. So it became, in a way, which of course I didn't realize till later, I was writing a roadmap for my own life, because within 4 years after the first book was published, Oliver was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and died at the age of 60, not nearly as young as my grandfather, who died at 33, but still I was left a widow too young.
It's interesting how that happens, isn't
I
it?
drew strength from my own character.
Oh, that's an incredible story. You never told me that before. Were you surprised at all by the incredible success of this book? Because it was a huge hit. It still is a huge hit.
Well, it was a sleeper. It wasn't an immediate hit. It really didn't become a bestseller until the paperback came out. But it got wonderfully interesting attention and response. And it was I just wanted to have a book published and have my name on a library card. It was so sad when the library abandoned their catalogs.
I know.
So everything that happened was a surprise, and I took, my expectations were really quite low, though to me having a book published was just the ultimate, because I've always loved to read so much. And I certainly never expected to write more than one book. It was a shock to find out people would ask, "What are you writing next?" I thought, I have to do this again.
Well, then there was the mini-series, and it was a great mini-series. We're showing some clips from it, and it's personal, too, because your daughter was in the mini-series.
My daughter Brooke plays me, yes.
That had to be.
That was greatly rewarding.
Great.
And then I also did a stage version of my third novel, Joanna's Husband and David's Wife. And my older daughter, Kendall, played me in that. So
it's all this cross-generational family thing. It's just, you really take the family art seriously. Writing is a family business, absolutely. What did you think of the miniseries? What about Sally Field stepping into the role as Beth?
What was wonderful about Sally Field, she really had not done much television at that time. So for a movie star to agree to do television was a very big thing. She had loved the book from the time it was first published, and she was the only viable star, and to my way of thinking, who could truly play the age range, believably play it.
That's a good point.
She was about 40 when she did it, but she was very believable as the young bride. And in the older scene, she was like Lillian Gish. I mean, if I hadn't known that was makeup, I thought she played the older Bess, who was more like my own grandmother, so brilliantly. There had been interest earlier when the book was first published by Jane Fonda, but she said she wouldn't attempt to play a younger person, that we'd have to get somebody else. And she ended up turning it down for that reason. But Sally really went after it. And it was one of the last 6-hour miniseries, but the writer and the producer, and I was very fortunate because they both loved the book and were as faithful to it as I think you could be while still translating it viably into another medium. They just said, we have to have 6 hours. We need that time. And Sally Field, the network, of course, wanted it shorter, and Sally Field said she wouldn't do it if they cut it down. So I really applaud her for that. I think she's at her best playing like Norma Ray, an underdog. And I think she was a little bit uncomfortable playing somebody with social aspirations. I mean, there's high comedy, I think, in the character's desire to be a part of society, and that doesn't come naturally to her. And I don't know that she enjoyed the comedy inherent in the role as much as she might have, though she's very good at comedy. But I was really, on the whole, terribly pleased with it. I thought it was beautifully photographed, beautifully directed, and I thought she was really quite wonderful.
How hard was it to adapt it for the stage?
The adapting it for the stage was very easy. I didn't do the television version. The stage is the book in a very compressed form. But once again, it was my playwright husband after we saw Julie Harris do her One Woman Emily Dickinson show, he said, "You could do that with your book." I said, "How?" I couldn't imagine. I think writing for the stage is so terrifying because there's the audience right there. With a book, you never know if someone throws it across the room or gets bored and falls asleep. But he said, "Well, let me show you." So he was teaching a class at a college about an hour from our home in Los Angeles. So he said, I was working on my second novel, struggling. He said, "I'll tell you what, you ride with me to the college." He taught 2 days a week. "And read your book out loud, and we'll sort of cut it together as we go, and we'll just whittle it down. It'll be a fun thing to do on the ride. And then while I'm teaching, you can work on your second novel in the library. And then on the ride home, we'll go back to the book." So it was a game.
Yeah, and no rest, though, for the Haileys. You were always writing.
Well, that was Oliver.
Yeah. Did you have an actress in mind as you were doing the adaptation?
I'm not sure, though. Barbara Rush had starred in Oliver's play Father's Day, playing the character based on Marion Seldes, our wonderful actress friend. And she loved the book, too, and had imagined it as a play. She had always expressed great interest. And so she became the first person we took our very rough draft to. And she was an enormous influence in shaping it. We started just working on it. And also, she had the faith in it, even though we didn't have a producer or a production scheduled. We had access to a little theater where Oliver had a playwright's workshop. And Oliver said, "Can you just give us some space to work on this?" And that's how we started. We just wanted to work on it. We didn't really know what was going to happen. And she had a lot of influence. She would say, "You're leaving out too much of the thought behind some of these. You have to not just do the actions." And so I'd go back and put things in. And I kind of became a playwright in the process. Oliver was certainly the one who initiated it and gave me the confidence to do it. And of course, every time she then did it, that led to production at that small theater. And from there, we went straight to Broadway, from a 90-seat theater in the San Fernando Valley to Broadway.
What was it like being on Broadway opening night?
Well, Oliver is in the Guinness Book of World Records as having more plays that opened and closed in one night on Broadway than any American playwright. So we were braced. Barbara had just thought it was all going to be wonderful because we'd been hailed in Los Angeles and she'd been given the LA Critics Award. But Oliver had the experience of coming into New York with a California hit. And he knew kind of what we were in for, though you always hope.
Sure.
So, I mean, it was very exciting to me just to be on Broadway, everything about it. But I don't think I was naive about what might happen. And so though the preview audiences were great, opening night at Sardi's, Oliver pretended he had forgotten his medication. By that time he had Parkinson's several years, and we had to go back to the hotel. The truth was he'd heard from somebody that there was a bad review in the New York Times, and he wanted to get me out of there before they could read it. And as we walked back to the hotel and he tried to prepare me, he said, "Well, turns out you're as good a writer as I am." I love playing around with form. My second novel was Life Sentences.
That's right.
And I was so terrified, and I thought, I can't do letters again. I have to try to write a real novel. And I went to the library and checked out books on how to write a novel. And
I remember that phase.
Got myself into such a state trying to deal with point of view and all these things that I really didn't know how to do. As it turned out, the book was programmed as a bestseller and did very well, but it was a painful birthing. With Joanna's Husband, David's Wife, I wanted to write the story of a marriage that would cover the time span of our marriage. We married in 1960, and the roles were changing all the time, so it was such an interesting time to see a marriage going through that transition. But I thought, well, you know, I'm not going to use my own life. I'll do alternating chapters from the point of view of husband and wife. And he was an architect or something. I don't know. I had a vague outline. And I'd written about 100 pages, and Oliver read it. I doubt I showed it to him. He was always finding where I'd hidden my pages and reading them and telling me they didn't work. And he said, "These people are so boring. Why don't you write about us?" I said, "Really?" Because it was kind of exciting in a way, because, you know, writing novels is a way to say the unsayable, as we've all been saying this weekend.
Yeah.
And I said, you really don't mind?" And so then I came up with the idea of her diary, which he finds 20 years into the marriage and adds his side of the story. And again, Oliver was the one who saw that it could be a play, which I didn't see. Much more difficult, because you're in two different time periods. So it was much harder, but I had to work much harder and do a lot more new writing on that one.
And then you also wrote the novel Home Free.
Yes, I was very affected by the families I was seeing on the streets in the 90s. Families, not, you know, the homeless were supposed to be alcoholics on Skid Row, bums, you know, who were there kind of because of things they'd done or hadn't done. The idea of seeing families and women and children suddenly homeless was devastating. And in my own neighborhood, you'd see a truck parked. So again, a sort of difficult evolution, finding my topic and my characters, but I wanted to deal with a homeless family. And of course, I was so affected by John Steinbeck and Grapes of Wrath. But the book was published in '91, so it's been a while, just as the country was going to war.
Thank you so much for being here, Betsy. And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.